The Hamptons, summer. The kind of afternoon that makes wealth look inevitable. Sprawling estates line Meadowbrook Lane like punctuation marks in a sentence about old money. Iron gates, manicured hedges. The particular silence of places that have never had to prove themselves. One gate stands slightly different from the rest. A woman walks toward it, alone, no invitation in her hand, no hesitation in her step, white hair, navy dress. A cognac briefcase worn at the corners from years of rooms that mattered. She stops at the gate. Her fingers find a seam in the iron. Rough, uneven, the kind of weld done in haste by someone hiding something underneath. She traces it once, then she pushes the gate open. Inside, 200 wedding guests, white tents, champagne, a family celebrating 22 years of calling this place home. The woman walks in like she owns it, because she does, and she has been waiting a very long time to prove it. Her hand found the seam before her eyes did. That was how she knew. Ruth Calloway pressed her fingers against the iron gate of Belmore Estate and felt the weld, rough, uneven, done in the particular haste of someone who needed a thing hidden and didn't much care how it looked from the inside. The new metal sat over the old the way a bad lie sits over a true story, convincing from a distance. Obvious up close, she found the ridge she was looking for, ran her thumb along it once, then she pushed the gate open and walked through. No invitation, no hesitation. No explanation offered to the security guard who had materialized at her left and was already drawing breath to speak. She simply walked the way a person walks into a room they have walked into 10,000 times before, the particular economy of motion that belongs to muscle memory and cannot be learned or faked. 68 years old, Tokbak Juan Tuan, a navy dress, clean and pressed, that had seen better occasions and didn't apologize for it. No jewelry, no sunglasses, no armor of any visible kind. She didn't need armor, she had something better, 22 years of patience. The security guard said, "Ma'am, this is a private." She said, "I know." Just that. 2 words and a direction of travel that didn't change. He stood there for a moment, holding the shape of his sentence with nowhere to put it. And then she was already across the threshold and moving into the garden, and the moment had passed, the way moments do when someone has decided they are done waiting for permission. The garden was exactly as she remembered it, and completely different, and somehow both at once. The way places are when you've been away long enough that the place has aged, but your memory of it hasn't. The rose bushes along the east path were still there, trimmed back harder than they liked. The stone fountain was still running. She could hear it before she could see it, the sound arriving ahead of her the way sound does in a familiar place. Like it had been waiting. She took the path without looking at it, avoided the 3rd flagstone on the left without looking down. Her father had said he would fix that flagstone every summer for 30 years and never had. 22 years after she'd last walked this path, it was still loose, still waiting. Some things have more patience than people. She took the shortcut through the passage beside the carriage house, the narrow way that didn't appear on any map and could only be known by accident or by growing up here. She knew it by growing up here. Her grandfather had shown it to her when she was 5 years old. He'd called it the rabbit path and made her promise not to tell anyone. She'd kept that promise for 63 years. A catering server came around the corner and nearly walked into her, stepped back, opened his mouth, then closed it. Because something in the way Quemtru moved this property was not the movement of someone who had wandered in from the street. It was the movement of someone returning, and those are 2 entirely different things. The body knows the difference even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. The server stepped aside. Ruth nodded once and kept walking. She moved through the garden slowly. Not the slowness of age, though her knees had opinions these days that her 20s had never consulted her about. The slowness of intention, of someone who has been away from something for a very long time and is not going to rush the return. The reflecting pool came into view around the bend of the east hedge. She stopped, just for a moment. The fountain was running, the way it always had. There was a slight irregularity in the east spout, had always been since the day the pool was built, that made it hit the surface at a fractionally different angle from the others. She had noticed that irregularity when she was 7 years old. She had asked her grandfather about it. He had looked at it, nodded slowly, and said, "That's character, baby girl. Don't fix what has character." She stood at the edge of the pool and looked at the stone wall beside it. 4 small holes in a horizontal line, 2 inches apart, eye level. The mortar around them different from the surrounding stone, older, a different composition, original. Someone had tried to fill them once, badly, in a hurry. The nameplate had hung there for 30 years, Callaway Estate. Brass, her grandfather, had commissioned it at a shop in the village, and paid cash and been proud of it in the uncomplicated way of a man who built things and was glad when they lasted. Gone now, but the holes remained. She looked at them for a long moment, then she turned and kept walking. The afternoon light moved with her. She reached the kitchen garden at the property's western edge and stopped there, briefly. This was where her grandfather had grown tomatoes. Her father had continued the habit, badly, cheerfully, with the optimism of a man who loved the idea of gardening more than the practice of it. The kitchen garden was flower beds now, had been for years, she imagined. Her father had thought that was funny. She could hear him saying it, flowers where the tomatoes were. Well, times change. She let herself think of him here, in this specific place, for one specific moment. Thomas Callaway. 72 years old in the summer of 1998, when she had visited for what turned out to be one of the last truly uncomplicated summers. When the house was still theirs, and the mornings were still coffee and newspaper, and her father's voice from the kitchen, and nobody had sent any letters yet. She had promised him something that summer. She remembered the morning precisely, the kitchen, the light through the east window. His hands flat on the table the way he put them when he wanted to say something that mattered. "Baby girl," he had said. "Promise me this house stays in the family. No matter what," she had said. "Dad, nothing's going to happen to the house." He had said, "Just promise me." She had promised. She had not known then what keeping that promise would cost. What it would require. How many years of patience it would demand from a person who was not by nature patient, who had chosen law precisely because law was a way of making impatient people wait for the right moment, and then moving with absolute precision when the moment came. She was 68 years old. The moment had come. She turned from the kitchen garden and walked back toward the reception. Earl Briggs was working the rose corner, 75 years old, back curved like a parenthesis written by time. His hands had been in this particular soil for 45 years, hands that knew the mineral content near the east fence by feel, that could diagnose drought stress from root disease by pressing a thumb against the base of a stem, that had pruned every rose on this property more times than any living person had counted. He was trimming, focused, the small, precise movements of someone whose best thinking happened when his hands were occupied. He didn't hear her coming. He felt it, the way you feel when something shifts in a room, when the quality of the air changes before any evidence arrives. Some part of him that was older than thought registered it, and his hands went still mid-cut, and he turned. The clippers dropped. He didn't reach for them. He stood and looked at her. This woman. This woman with the white hair and the navy dress and the eyes. Those same eyes he'd been seeing in the photograph on his nightstand for 2 decades. Because he'd kept one, a photograph from years ago, when she'd visited with her father during what turned out to be one of the last good summers. He'd kept it because he hadn't known what else to do with what happened after. He crossed the grass toward her, slower than he once would have. An old injury in the right knee slowing him down in the way of things that have been compensated for so long they've become part of the gate. But he crossed it, and then Earl Briggs, 75 years old, went down on one knee, on the immaculate lawn of Belmore Estate, in front of whatever portion of 200 wedding guests happened to be looking in this direction. He put one knee on the ground and he held his hat in both hands and he looked up at Ruth Callaway. "Miss Ruth?" His voice was not steady. It had not been fully steady for years, but today less than ever. "You came back." The words came out like something released from a very long compression. 22 years of a sentence finally spoken. The lawn went quiet, not the polite quiet of people pausing their conversations. The complete quiet of people who understand they are witnessing something they don't have the context for and are waiting for context to arrive. Ruth looked down at him. Her expression was not surprise. She had known Earl would be here. Had known it with the specific certainty of someone who had been paying his salary through a trust account for 20 years and had received quarterly reports on the garden's condition from the management company she'd hired in 2003 to maintain what she couldn't yet return to claim. "Earl," she said, "get up your knee." He stood. Slowly, with the dignity of someone doing a difficult thing because it was the right thing and not caring what it looked like. He retrieved the clippers from the grass, held them in one hand, hat in the other. "Your father," he said quietly. He would have been so glad to see this day. He turned and walked back toward the roses, but his eyes, when they caught hers one last time across the distance, held something that had been waiting a very long time for somewhere to go. Margaret Whitfield saw the whole thing from the terrace. 58 years old, Patek Philippe on her left wrist. A dress from a designer whose name she mentioned in conversation with the particular casualness of someone who wants the name heard but doesn't want to appear to want it heard. Hair perfect in the way that requires daily maintenance and a good stylist and the discipline not to touch it even when you want to. Posture perfect. The practiced uprightness of a woman who had spent decades building herself into something that announced its own value without appearing to try. She set her champagne glass down on the terrace railing, crossed the lawn with the purposeful stride of a woman who has handled situations before and considers herself good at it. "Earl," her voice reached him before she did, scissors across silk. "What are you doing? Get up." But he was already up, already returning to the roses, which was somehow more unsettling than if he stayed down. He'd made his gesture and retreated into the dignity of motion, and she had nothing to confront. She turned to the woman in the navy dress, and this was the moment. Not the moment the estate would change hands. Not the moment justice would arrive. Just this first moment. Two women on a summer lawn. One whose dress announced its designer in its cut. One whose dress announced nothing at all, except that someone had ironed it that morning and meant to show up. "Excuse me," Margaret's voice was calibrated, polite enough to be civil, sharp enough to be unmistakable. "This is a private event." Ruth looked at her. "I know," she said. 2 words, same 2 words she'd used on the security guard, delivered with the same quality of absolute sufficiency, as if those 2 words contained a complete response to anything else that might follow. Margaret blinked, because the expected response, the correct social response to being gently but firmly told you are somewhere you don't belong, was explanation. Apology, the small physical contraction of someone caught somewhere wrong. She had seen that response hundreds of times. She knew exactly what it looked like. This was not that. This woman was looking at her with the calm patience of someone who has been waiting and has decided today that waiting is finished. Who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay. Not because she is defiant, because she is correct. "This estate is hosting a private family celebration," Margaret said slower, with the particular clarity she kept for people who needed it. "You need to leave." Ruth didn't move. She looked at Margaret the way you look at something when you're deciding not whether to explain it, but when. "I think," she said, "there may be some confusion." "The confusion," Margaret said, "is that you're still standing on my property." Ruth looked around, the garden, the fountain, the old stone wall along the north boundary with its particular lean. Her grandfather had never fixed it, said it gave the place character. The carriage house roof, re-shingled 20 years ago by someone who hadn't seen the original and had laid the ridge going the wrong direction. Small things, things you only knew if you'd known them always. "Yes," Ruth said quietly, "your property," and something in the specific weight she placed on that first word made Margaret's hand close around a champagne glass she was no longer holding. The confrontation that followed had the structure of a campaign. Margaret was organized about it. She summoned Sylvia Crane with a glance, 55 years old, silk blouse, earrings like small announcements of net worth, and Sylvia arrived with the instinct of a woman who had spent 40 years choosing the winning side of social situations. "What's happening?" Sylvia asked. "Being handled," Margaret said. Harrison Blackwell materialized from the left with his scotch glass and the comfortable energy of a man who enjoys other people's conflicts from a safe distance. "She just walked right in," he said, with the appreciation of someone describing an interesting natural phenomenon. "Bold as you please. Security should have stopped it. Should have called the police immediately, and just like that, the way these things work." The circle formed. Not a violent circle, a social one. The particular configuration of people who have decided collectively that something is wrong and are now reflecting that decision between themselves until it becomes the only reality available. Each voice added confidence to the next. Each agreement made the next agreement easier. Ruth stood in the center of it and did not respond. She was doing something that made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. She was looking at faces, slowly, systematically. moving from one to the next with the methodical attention of someone building a record. Not angry, not afraid, just noting. The way a person notes things when they know the notes will matter. "What are you doing?" Margaret demanded. "Observing," Ruth said. "Observing what? Which question do you want answered first?" "Not a question. A sentence that ended where a question would." "Security." Margaret's voice went flat and final. "Remove this woman now." Two men in dark jackets moved toward Ruth with the resigned posture of people executing a task they already sense is more complicated than they've been told. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us." "Of course," Ruth said, and she came with them, spine straight, chin level, hands at her sides in the relaxed stillness of someone who has decided that what's about to happen is fine, because what comes after is what matters. She walked through the gate. She walked to her car parked across the street and opened the trunk. She removed a briefcase. Cognac-colored leather. The corners worn in the way of something carried a long time through rooms that matter. The security guard who had followed her stopped, because there was something about the federal seals visible at the edges of the folders inside, and something about the way this woman opened that case with the practiced efficiency of someone who had opened it in rooms with wood-paneled walls and oath-administered testimony, that made the word "ma'am" form in his mouth and go nowhere. "Documentation," Ruth said, not to him specifically, into the air, as if naming a category. She closed the case, turned, walked back toward the gate. She sat down at an empty table at the far edge of the reception lawn. The table had been laid for guests who hadn't arrived. White cloth, unused place settings. A small floral centerpiece that was working very hard and getting no credit for it. Ruth set the briefcase on the table, opened it, removed a folder, and began to read. Slowly, with the deliberate calm of someone reviewing documents before a proceeding. Which was, in a sense, exactly what she was doing. Margaret stared from across the lawn, actually stared. The open-mouthed kind she would have corrected in her children and in herself, but was temporarily unable to prevent. "She's back," said Sylvia, as if reporting a weather event. "She can't," Harrison began. "She is," said someone with better eyes than him. "Those look like legal papers." Margaret was already moving. "Do not serve that woman anything," she said to the nearest server without slowing down. "Do not speak to her. Is that understood?" She reached Ruth's table and deployed the full architecture of 22 years of social authority. "You need to leave." Ruth turned a page. "You've mentioned that." "I'm not asking. I know." Another page. "You haven't asked me anything since I arrived. You've only told." A beat that had some weight to it. "This is our family's estate," Margaret said. "You are trespassing." "Interesting word," Ruth said. "It is the correct word." "Is it?" Ruth looked up. Not a challenge. A question that wasn't quite a question, the kind that only functions if the other person is willing to actually think about it. "What makes a place yours, Mrs. Whitfield? 20 years of living in it, maintaining it, building a life inside it." Ruth looked back at her documents. She said. Which was somehow worse than anything else she might have said. The photographer Owen, 34 years old, hired to document a wedding and currently documenting something significantly larger, had been working the long lens from a respectful distance since the confrontation began. His instincts told him something was happening here that would matter later. His instincts had been right before. "Delete those photos," Owen said, appearing at his elbow. Owen's hand moved to the delete button. He did not press it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and kept his finger there, and did not press it. Ruth, 20 feet away, noted the exchange without looking directly at either of them. The lawyer in her, 19 years on the federal bench, before that a decade of practice, never stopped running its quiet machinery. Cataloging, sequencing, building the record that this room was generating whether it intended to or not. The young women in expensive summer dresses had migrated toward Hurtable, drawn by the gravity of a situation they didn't understand but wanted to be part of. "Excuse me," the leader said, blonde, confident with the confidence of someone who had not yet been seriously wrong about anything. "This is a private event." "You're right," Ruth said. "Then you should leave." She returned to her documents. "That's incredibly rude, is it? Not rising, to not performing calm either. Just, there, you can't sit here." "I am sitting here," Ruth said. "Whether I can is a separate question." The group laughed among themselves with the particular performance of people demonstrating disbelief for each other's benefit. Ruth reached into the briefcase, removed a legal pad and a pen, and began to write date, time, Names she'd heard used, descriptions of those whose names she hadn't. The shorthand of someone who had spent decades in rooms where what people said had consequences. She's writing about us. A voice tightened. She's literally writing things down. You can't record private conversations. This is harassment. Ruth capped the pen, looked up at the circle that had formed around her table, drew one breath. I'm documenting, she said. There's a distinction. Documenting what? Margaret from behind them. Choice. Ruth, who is present, what they said, in what sequence. At what volume? She looked around the circle slowly. It's remarkable what a room will reveal about itself when it believes it's in control. Silence. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that arrives when people begin, slowly and against their will, to wonder if they've misread something fundamental. You're threatening us, Margaret said. I'm noting that this gathering is creating a record of its own behavior, Ruth said. Whether that record becomes relevant is a separate question. She looked at Margaret directly. In my experience, it often does. The color in Margaret's face went past red and into something more controlled and more dangerous. Security, remove her now. I'm calling the police myself. Wait, one word from the direction of the parking area, a man's voice. And something in it, some quality of quiet authority, made the lawn go still in the way crowds go still when they sense something shifting. Detective Orrin Pruitt walked out of the late afternoon sun. 52 years old, the build of someone who had been athletic for practical rather than aesthetic reasons and had maintained the habit. A face that had absorbed enough experience to stop registering surprise at most things. He was wearing a blazer over a button-down shirt because this was a wedding and he had made an effort. The wedding invitation was visible in his breast pocket. He was a guest here, had known the Whitfield family for years. Had come because these invitations happened and you went, because it was Southampton and connections were the currency, because he hadn't thought much about it one way or the other when he'd RSVP'd 2 months ago. He crossed the lawn toward the small crowd gathered around the table. He saw Ruth Calloway, stopped. His body stopped before his brain had processed why. He knew her, had known her before Belmore was Belmore in Whitfield family history, had known her name in 2002, had known it in the specific way of someone who encountered a file, and read it carefully enough to understand what it contained, and then made a decision he had spent 22 years not examining too closely. His face went pale. Not the pale of surprise, the pale of a man who has just walked into the reckoning he spent 2 decades keeping at a careful distance, and who finds that distance has run out. He removed his hat. Ruth, he said, quietly. To nod to the crowd, Margaret spun around. You know this woman? Pruitt looked from Margaret to Ruth, to the crowd, to the gate with its welded seam, to Earl Briggs, working the roses with his back turned. Read the situation in 3 seconds his training gave him. The briefcase, the federal folders, the legal pad, the particular quality of composure Ruth carried that was not the composure of someone waiting to be rescued, but the composure of someone who had everything she needed and was choosing her moment. He understood what she was doing here. He understood what she'd had for years if he was reading it right. Why she'd waited, why today? Yeah, he said to Margaret with deliberate slowness. I know her? Then help us. She's trespassing. Do your job. Pruitt looked at his hat, then at the gate, then at the 4 small holes in the stone wall beside the reflecting pool, visible from here if you knew what you were looking at. Ma'am, he said, I don't think I can do that. Excuse me, you're a detective. I know what I am. He met her eyes. That's the problem, the crowd murmured. Something in his tone that no one quite knew what to do with. Not defiance, not deference. The specific register of a man who has just made a decision about who he intends to be in this particular room on this particular afternoon. Margaret's eyes narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? Pruitt looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him. 22 years of a silence that had cost something lived in the space between them. He could see it in her face. Not anger, not quite. The expression of someone who has carried a weight so long they've stopped noticing the shape of it. Not yet set down, but close. He turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Public record search. Nassau County Property Database. Takes 30 seconds. Would you like me to run it? That is completely unnecessary. It is if you're right. He held her gaze. It isn't if you're not. The lawn went completely quiet, the kind of quiet where the fountain is suddenly the loudest thing, where you can hear a champagne glass set down too carefully on a cloth-covered table across the grass. where Earl Briggs in the rose corner stops what he's doing and bows his head because he knows what a property search is going to find, and has known for 22 years. Margaret said. Run it because she had lived in certainty for 2 decades. Because the idea of checking felt like an insult to the certainty itself. Because some convictions become so structural that questioning them feels like questioning the floor beneath your feet. Pruitt typed. The screen loaded. He read. His face did not change dramatically, the face of a man receiving confirmation of what he already on some level knew. Belmore Estate, he said. 1180 Meadowbrook Lane, Southampton. He scrawled original title. Samuel Calloway Sr., purchased 1924. He scrolled further. Transferred to Robert Calloway, 1958. Transferred to Thomas Calloway, 1981. He paused, looked up at Margaret, whose face was cycling through something complicated. Transferred by inheritance to Ruth Calloway, 2004. He turned the phone so the screen was visible to the people nearest him. Property taxes paid continuously, Calloway Family Trust. He looked at the dates, from 2004 to present, not 1 year missing. The silence that fell over the reception lawn was different from the silences before it, not social, not strategic. The silence of a room in which the ground has just shifted under everyone's feet at once, and no one has yet decided what to do about it. That's impossible, Margaret said. The first uncontrolled sentence she had produced all afternoon. We've lived here, 20 years. We've maintained this property. We've, without a lease, Ruth said. Everyone looked at her. She had not stood up, had not raised her voice. Was sitting at the same table, in the same chair, with her documents in front of her, and her hands resting on either side of them. Without permission, she said. Without paying rent. She said it the way you state a fact in a room that has been operating without facts for a very long time. Not cruelty, not triumph. The actual ground, solid and old and unchanged, made finely visible. Margaret Whitfield looked at the woman at the table, at the iron gate with its welded seam, at the 4 holes in the stone wall beside the reflecting pool, at Earl Briggs, who had turned from the roses and was looking across the garden at this moment, with his hat pressed flat between both hands. Then she looked at Orrin Pruitt, who was looking at the ground, who was not meeting her eyes, who had a very specific reason for that. A reason that dated to 2002, to a file he had opened and read and quietly closed and transferred precincts away from. A reason he had been carrying in an unlabeled box alongside the other decisions he'd made young and regretted slowly. Who is she? Margaret asked, quieter now, not the commanding register, something closer to actual asking. Pruitt was still for a moment. The fountain, a bird somewhere in the oak tree, the sound of Owen the photographer carefully, very carefully, not pressing the delete button. Someone, Pruitt said, who has been very patient. He looked at Ruth. She looked back, and in the space between them, 22 years of a story that was only now beginning to be told aloud, she gave the faintest nod. Not permission, recognition, that he was here, that he had come, that whatever this afternoon required of him, he was going to have to provide it. He squared his shoulders, replaced his hat, looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who has just finished making a decision. Call your lawyer, he said. You're going to want to. I already did, she said. Good, he looked at Ruth. Then at the briefcase, at the federal folder visible at the edge of it, at everything that folder likely contained. Then we wait, he said. Ruth opened the briefcase, removed the federal folder, placed it on the table in front of her, with the particular care of someone setting down something they have carried for a very long time. The gold of the federal seal caught the afternoon light, warm, precise, real. Owen raised his camera. This time Margaret Whitfield did not tell him to stop. Gerald Foss arrived at 417, the kind of man who had built his entire professional identity around walking into rooms and immediately becoming the most certain person in them. 57 years old, grey suit with the particular drape of something made rather than bought, pocket square, a briefcase that announced its own quality without having to say anything about it. He had the stride of someone who expected the crowd to part, and had been right about that expectation for 30 years. The crowd parted. He came through the gate and crossed the lawn with the pace of someone who has handled this before, and will handle it now and will handle the next one after that. Margaret was already moving toward him, real relief on her face for the first time all afternoon, the kind that drops the shoulders 2 inches and loosens the jaw without the person noticing. Gerald, She took his arm. Thank God, she has federal documents, property files. She's been sitting there for 20 minutes like she belongs here. I need you to tell them, where is she? The table by the fountain, the navy dress, he was already looking. Gerald Foss stopped. His briefcase hit the grass. Not placed, not set down, hit. The sound of something released by hands that forgot they were holding anything because every available unit of attention had just redirected itself toward a single point across the lawn. Judge Calloway. His voice came out wrong. Too small, too careful. The voice of a man who walked into a room expecting one situation and found a fundamentally different one and has not yet finished processing the gap between them. Margaret stared at him. You know her? Gerald was not looking at Margaret. He was looking at Ruth, who was looking back at him with the specific patience of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment and made her peace with how it would feel a long time ago. Gerald, Margaret's voice sharpened, tell them the documents are fabricated. Tell them this is fraud. That's what I called you for. Margaret. He said her name the way you say a name when you need someone to stop adding to a problem. Quiet, firm. The register of a lawyer who has just understood the scope of what his client has walked into and needs her to stop walking. He picked up his briefcase, crossed her, took her arm and moved her 3 deliberate steps away from the nearest guests. Pruitt stayed where he was, close enough to hear. He did not move away. That woman, Gerald said, very low, is Judge Ruth Calloway. Retired, Eastern District of New York, 19 years on the federal bench. Retired, Margaret said, so federal judges don't stop being federal judges when they retire, Margaret. They stop receiving a government salary. They don't stop having the credibility, the contacts, the institutional relationships. He glanced back at Ruth, who had returned to her documents with the serenity of someone waiting for a scheduled event. And they don't stop having the evidence. What evidence? She has some papers, old property records she found somewhere, and she has a federal evidence file, Gerald said. That folder on the table, that's not a prop. I know what those seals look like, and I know what it means when they're on a folder that someone has been carrying around for a long time. He looked at Margaret directly. Her conviction rate was 97%. In 19 years on the bench. 97. A pause. Margaret working through it. She's retired, she said again. Different emphasis this time, less certain. She's been paying property taxes on this estate for 20 years, Gerald said. 20 continuous years, Margaret. Tax records don't fabricate themselves, and they don't maintain themselves for 2 decades without someone actively filing them. He paused. Pruitt ran the county records. I saw his face when he read them. Margaret looked at Gerald's face, which was doing something she had not seen it do in 23 years of professional acquaintance. It was afraid. Not the performed caution of a lawyer managing risk. Actual fear. The fear of someone who has just walked into a room and understood that the ceiling is significantly lower than he was told. What do I do, she said. Not a question exactly. The sentence of someone working through what they already know. You stop talking, Gerald said. Right now, you stop talking and you let me think. She stopped talking, which was, for Margaret Whitfield, an act of considerable will. Gerald looked across the lawn at Ruth Calloway reading her documents at a table that had been laid for guests who hadn't arrived. He looked at the briefcase, at the federal folder, at the particular quality of stillness Ruth carried. Not the stillness of someone waiting to be saved, but the stillness of someone spent years preparing for a single afternoon proceeding exactly as planned. He looked at Pruitt, who was looking at the gate with the expression of a man taking inventory of decisions he cannot unmake. Gerald picked up his phone, made a call he did not want to make, spoke quietly for 40 seconds, hung up. Looked at Margaret. When we acquired this property in 2002, he said carefully, who handled the transaction documents on our side? Margaret was very still. You did. I processed the paperwork I was given, Gerald said. I didn't originate the transaction. Who told you this property was available? Who made the initial contact with? He stopped himself, looked at the grass. Looked up. Who handled this before it came to me, Margaret? A silence, long enough to mean something. We should have that conversation privately, Margaret said. Yes, Gerald said, we should, but neither of them moved toward private, because across the lawn, Ruth Calloway had closed her folder, set her pen down on the legal pad and stood up. And everyone who had been watching, which by now was everyone on the lawn who could see anything, went quiet and watched where she was going. Ruth didn't go toward Margaret, didn't go toward Pruitt or Gerald or the gate or the parking area. She picked up the briefcase and walked toward the garden. And something happened that no one quite planned. People followed, not because anyone announced it, because the pull of someone moving through a space with that particular quality of purposeful knowledge is something the human animal responds to below the level of conscious decision. You follow because you sense that wherever she is going, something will be made clear. And the desire for clarity, after an afternoon of gathering confusion, is stronger than social caution. Margaret followed because she wasn't about to let this woman move through her property unsupervised. Gerald followed because he needed to understand what he was working with. Pruitt followed because he had made a choice when he'd squared his shoulders and put his hat back on, and that choice required him to be present for what came next. Sylvia followed, then Harrison, then the guests who had been watching from the terrace, then the catering staff who had been watching from every doorway and window available to them. Owen moved along the edge of the group, long lens working. Ruth walked to the carriage house. She stopped at the foundation wall and crouched down. Carefully, the deliberate crouch of a 68-year-old woman whose knees are consulted on such matters these days. She pointed to the corner where the concrete changed, rougher, older, a different texture from the later additions. My great-grandfather built this foundation in 19, she said, not loudly, not performing, informing. He came up from much work, a set of hand tools, and enough money to start but not enough to finish. He poured this himself. Took him 3 weeks, working alone on weekends while he held a construction job during the week. She pointed to a specific section of the corner, SC, 1921. He carved his initials when the building was complete. Took him 2 years from the foundation to the finished structure, and he wanted it recorded. She straightened, looked at the people around her. Anyone who wants to verify that is welcome to go look. 3 people moved toward the foundation without being asked. A man in his 50s crouched down and looked, ran his fingers over the concrete, stood up, came back, did not say anything. But his face had changed in the way faces change when an expectation has been replaced by a fact. Ruth walked to the reflecting pool. The fountain was running, that slight irregularity in the east spout still sending its stream at the fractionally different angle it had always used. She stood at the stone wall and pointed to the 4 holes, 2 inches apart, horizontal, eye level. My grandfather installed a brass nameplate here in 1951, she said. He'd built this pool the previous year to mark his return from service. He had the nameplate made at a shop in Southampton, the old one on Elm, which has been a different business 3 times since then. He paid $40 for it. He was proud of that price, and he was proud of what it said. She looked at the holes. Not at the crowd. Someone removed it. The work was quick. The original mortar is still visible around each anchor point, a different composition than the surrounding stone, original to the wall's construction. If you look at it directly, you can see where the covering mortar was applied later, unevenly, in a hurry. She didn't look at Margaret when she said this. She didn't need to. Several guests had moved to examine the wall. They looked at the holes, at the mortar, came back to the group. One woman, older, wearing the careful expression of someone who had come to a wedding and was now having a different kind of day than she'd planned, said quietly, "She's right. You can see it." Margaret said nothing. Ruth walked to the oak tree. She put her hand on the bark and moved it to a specific spot, 3rd branch height north face, where the bark had grown thick and slightly different in texture over a wound that was decades old. My father was 41 years old, she said. Summer of 1967. He had just inherited stewardship of this property from his father. My grandfather had handed him the deed that spring and told him the land was his to keep now. The way a man processes that kind of responsibility at 41 when he has spent his whole life watching his father tend something is to mark it. Her hand stayed on the bark, to say I was here. This is mine to carry forward. She stepped back from the tree. TC 1967. The bark has been growing over it for 57 years. You can feel the ridge if you press here. People moved toward it. Pressed their hands where she had indicated. Found the ridge. Felt the outline of letters beneath the bark that had been growing over them since the summer of 1967. When a 41-year-old man had stood in this garden and understood that the land was now his responsibility. The man who had checked the foundation concrete was standing slightly apart from the group now, looking at the property with the expression of someone revising a long-held assumption in real time. Earl Briggs had followed at the edge of the group. He had not been invited and had not asked. He was carrying his hat in both hands, and his face held the particular expression of some present at something they have been carrying alone for a very long time, and are finally in the right company to set down. Margaret watched him. "You knew," she said to him, not loudly, "the private accusation of someone who doesn't want the answer to be what they suspect." This whole time, Earl looked at his hat, then at Ruth, then at Margaret. "Her grandfather hired my father in 1945, he said. His voice was steady in the way of something that has been prepared. Not rehearsed, prepared. The distinction being that one is performance and the other is readiness. My father worked this land for 30 years. I started here when I was 23 years old." He touched the brim of the hat with his thumb. "I know every inch of this property. I know where the drainage changes under the east lawn. I know which window rattles when the wind comes off the sound from the northeast. Know which roses were planted by which member of which family in which decade." He looked at Margaret. "I know," he said, "whose land this is." The words landed in the silence without embellishment. He was not performing conviction. He simply had it, the way you have things you've known for 45 years that have never needed defending until now. Margaret opened her mouth. Because there was something in Earl's face, the unbothered certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose by telling the truth, that made argument feel like the wrong instrument entirely. Margaret recovered that was the thing about her. She was not a woman who stayed down. She'd built a life on the specific skill of regrouping, of finding the angle, of transforming the energy of a reversal into the engine of a counterattack. She turned to the assembled guests with the ease of a hostess who's managed difficult moments before and intends to manage this one. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "what we're witnessing is a sophisticated attempt to exploit old historical records. Someone has done considerable research into this property's past and constructed an elaborate. The foundation initials are original," said the man who had checked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just stated. Margaret looked at him. He looked back with the mild apology of someone who feels obliged to say a true thing in a room that would prefer he didn't. "The mortar around the nameplate holes is clearly original to the wall," said the woman who had examined them. "I felt the initials in the oak tree," said someone else. Younger. A guest who had come for a wedding and found himself with different information than he'd expected to leave with. Margaret looked at her lawyer, Gerald. Gerald was looking at the folder on the garden wall where Ruth had set it down. The federal folder, closed, sitting there with its gold seal like a patient and very final argument. "Even if there's some historical connection to her family," Margaret said, pivoting again, "there are legal frameworks that govern long-term occupation. Adverse possession, prescriptive easement. The law doesn't simply. Adverse possession in New York State requires 10 years of hostile, continuous open possession," Ruth said, "against a titled owner who has abandoned the claim." She looked at Margaret. "I have paid property taxes on this estate every year since 2004. I have maintained a continuous legal claim through an active trust. I have never abandoned it." She paused. "I simply wasn't here. There is a legal distinction between absence and abandonment." Margaret looked at Gerald. Gerald said nothing, which was, Margaret understood, a very complete answer. "Where is your deed?" Pruitt asked. Professionally, not unkindly, the tone of someone trying to be fair to both sides of a situation he already suspects is not balanced. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you have documentation of purchase? A title transfer? A recorded sale?" Margaret opened her mouth. "In the house," she said. "In the safe. Would you like to retrieve it?" A pause, 5 seconds. 6. "I would need to locate the combination," she said. "Of course," Pruitt said. And said nothing further, because nothing further was necessary. Ruth reached into the briefcase and withdrew the manila folder, older than the federal one, its edges soft with handling, the kind of folder that has been opened and closed many times over many years. She placed it on the garden wall and opened it. "In 2002, she said, my father received a letter. The lawn was very quiet. From Whitfield Property Group." Margaret went still, completely still. The particular stillness of someone who has just heard words they knew were coming and have been dreading in the specific way you dread things you cannot control. The letter stated that Belmore Estate had been sold at a court-ordered proceeding to satisfy outstanding estate debts. Ruth removed the letter from the folder and placed it on the wall. It included a probate case number, a court date, a notarized transaction record. She looked at the letter, then at the assembled guests. The debts did not exist. The probate case number referenced a landlord dispute filed in Rockland County in 1989. Nothing to do with this property, this family, or this county. The court date cited does not appear in any Nassau County Court record, and the notary whose seal appears on the transaction document had surrendered her license in 2001 and relocated to another state. She looked at the letter lying on the stone wall. My father was 76 years old when he received this. He believed it because it had official seals on it, because it had numbers that looked like case numbers, because he was a man who had spent his entire life believing that documents meant what they said, that if a thing was written down officially, it was true. Her voice stayed even, precise, the voice of someone reading from a record of facts, not because the facts are easy, but because precision is the only adequate container for them. He believed he had failed his father and his grandfather, and the promise that had been made across 4 generations of this family. He believed he had lost something through some failure of his own that he couldn't identify or correct. She touched the edge of the letter. Did not pick it up. He died in April of 2004, 78 years old. He never came back to this property. He never knew that the letter was fraudulent. He never knew that the title had never transferred. Her finger rested on the paper. Still, he died thinking it was his fault. The fountain ran. Somewhere in the oak tree, a bird, the particular quality of silence that descends when a room of people has collectively understood something they cannot ununderstand. Then Pruitt said quietly, "You found this in 2009? I began building the evidentiary record in 2009, Ruth said. 7 years after the fraud, 5 years after my father died. It took 4 more years to document it sufficiently. I filed with the Federal Evidence Office in 2013. 11 years, Pruitt said. Not a question. Something falling into place. You've had this for 11 years, and you waited." "I was waiting," Ruth said, "to see whether the people involved were capable of change." She looked at the property around her, the garden, the carriage house, the oak tree, the reflecting pool. Whether that patience was well placed. Today will answer that. Gerald Foss cleared his throat. Even if we accept the assertion that the 2002 documentation was improperly obtained, and I want to be clear that I am not conceding that, there remain questions of what remedies are appropriate at this stage, what statutes of Gerald. Ruth looked at him, just his name. In the register she had used for 30 years in courtrooms when a lawyer was saying something that wasn't going to work. "You know what this file contains?" Gerald looked at the federal folder, then at his shoes. "Yes," he said. Quietly, "I do. Then let's not waste the afternoon on arguments you know won't hold." "No," Gerald said. "I suppose we shouldn't." Margaret looked at him with an expression that had run out of labels. She had brought him here to end this, and he was standing in her garden, agreeing with the woman she needed him to defeat. "Gerald." "Margaret." He turned to her. Something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not apology, but the thing that lives adjacent to it, that carries some of its weight without claiming its name. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She looked at him. "Whitfield Property Group," he said carefully. "The entity named on the 2002 letter. Before I processed those documents, before they came to me, who originated the transaction? Who told you this property was available and handled the initial contact?" A silence. "Long enough, Robert," she said. Her ex-husband's name, said simply, without drama or deflection, the name of a man who had been out of her life for 18 years. "It came through Robert. He had connections in property acquisition and he brought it to me as an opportunity. He said the estate was being liquidated." She paused. "He handled the paperwork before it came to you, and you questioned it," Gerald said. "Not accusation. Statement." "I had a question," Margaret said. "One question. About the speed of the transaction." She looked at the letter on the wall. "Robert said that estate liquidations moved quickly, that if we didn't act we'd lose the opportunity." She paused. "I chose to believe him, because it was what we needed, and I preferred believing him to asking the question I was already half asking." Gerald nodded. The nod of a man receiving confirmation of what he suspected, and finding it neither better nor worse than he feared. "Robert Whitfield," Pruitt said. Writing in his notebook now, professional, focused. Is he still in the area? He lives in Connecticut, Margaret said. Greenwich, I'll need his full contact information, Pruitt said. Before the end of today. Margaret looked at him. Then at Ruth. Ruth said nothing. She was looking at the letter on the wall, at the Whitfield Property Group letterhead, at the forged notary seal, at the case number referencing a landlord dispute from another county, another decade, another world entirely. Robert Whitfield had originated the fraud. Margaret Whitfield had chosen not to ask the question that would have uncovered it. Both things were true simultaneously. Neither erased the other. The law would distinguish between them, would assign them different weights, different consequences, different categories of culpability. But the account between this property and the Calloway family was not only a legal account, it was a human one. And human accounts are less interested in distinctions of origination. Ruth turned from the letter. Gerald, she said, I think it's time. Gerald looked at the briefcase, at the federal folder, at the documents he understood were inside it. Yes, he said. I think it is. Nora appeared at Declan's side, 31 years old, still in her wedding dress, wearing it with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had larger concerns than the dress. Her face had the focused attention of a woman who had been watching the garden situation develop for the last 20 minutes, and who had understood more of it than anyone had explained to her. Declan, she said quietly. Who is she? He didn't answer right away. He was watching Ruth cross the garden toward the group by the reflecting pool, watching the way she moved through this space, the specific unhurried rightness of it, the way a person moves through somewhere that has always been theirs. 4 years ago, he said, I stood in a federal courtroom and she was the judge. Nora was very still. What were the charges? Securities fraud. He looked at his hands. Deliberate. The evidence was clear. I had done it, and I knew I had done it, and there was no version of that afternoon where I was going to walk out free. He paused. Except that I did. Nora looked at him. What happened? She sentenced me to probation. Restitution, full restitution to every person I'd taken money from, financial counseling. 200 hours of community service. He watched Ruth. I expected 15 years. The prosecutor was asking for 15. She had every reason to give me 15. Why didn't she? He stopped, swallowed. She said I was 31 years old and that the record showed I had been brought into certain practices before I fully understood what they were, and that the record also showed I had continued those practices after I did understand, and that those two facts were in tension and that she was choosing to give weight to the first. He looked at Nora. She said he was choosing to believe the person I might become rather than convicting the person I currently was. Nora said nothing. I spent 200 hours at a food bank in Queens, he said. I sat across the table from people who had lost things. Not because of bad luck. Because of people who made the decisions I had been making. His jaw tightened. It was the most important 200 hours of my life. He looked across the garden at his mother, who was standing at the reflecting pool, looking at the 4 small holes in the stone wall with the expression of someone counting the cost of something. She saved my life, Declan said. Not metaphorically. I would have spent the years between 31 and 46 in federal prison. Those are the years I met you. Those are the years I became someone you might want to marry. He was quiet for a moment. She gave me those years, and I don't know if I ever said it to her in a way that was adequate. Nora watched his face. What are you going to do? She asked. He looked toward the band equipment at the edge of the dance floor. At the microphone on its stand, the sound system still lived, the speakers positioned to carry across the entire reception lawn. Something I should have figured out how to do 4 years ago, he said. Nora looked at the microphone, looked at him, understood what he meant. Okay, she said. Not a small okay. The okay of someone who has decided to trust a person they married 3 hours ago with something that is going to change the shape of their wedding day. He kissed her once, on the temple, briefly, with the gratitude of someone who recognizes what they've been given, and walked toward the microphone. The sound system carried his voice across the entire property. Ladies and gentlemen, the garden group looked up. The terrace guests turned. The catering staff in the doorways went still. Owen, 30 feet away, turned his camera. Everyone on the lawn of Belmore Estate looked at Declan Whitfield standing at the band's microphone on his wedding day. I need to say something, he said. And I need to say it here, in front of all of you. Because what's been happening this afternoon deserves a true account. and I'm the only person here in a position to give part of it. Margaret was already moving toward him from the garden. Declan, Mom, he said it with love, full, uncomplicated love, and with a finality that stopped her in place as effectively as a locked door. Please. She stopped. He looked out at the assembled guests. 200 people who had arrived expecting a wedding and were receiving something they hadn't planned for and would spend years trying to describe to people who weren't there. 4 years ago, he said, I stood in a federal courtroom facing charges for securities fraud. The evidence was clear and I was guilty and I knew it. He let that sit, gave the room a moment to absorb it. The woman who has spent this afternoon being questioned, dismissed, and asked to leave this property, she was the judge. The kind of silence you can feel. She could have sentenced me to 15 years. The prosecutor was asking for 15. I had taken money from people who trusted me, and I had done it knowingly, and I deserved what the prosecutor was asking for. His voice was even, steady in the way of someone who has thought about what he was going to say but isn't reading it. She sentenced me to probation, restitution, 200 hours of community service. He looked at Ruth, who had turned toward the microphone when he'd started speaking, who was standing at the edge of the garden group with the federal folder in her hands, and her face composed in the expression of someone watching something they had quietly hoped for and were now watching arrive. I spent those 200 hours at a food bank in Brooklyn, Declan said, serving meals to people who had lost things. Jobs, savings, homes, the stability that most people in this room have never had to imagine losing. I sat across the table from them. I learned what I had been participating in when I made the choices I made. He paused. It was the most important thing that ever happened to me, more important than today, even, because without it there wouldn't be a today. He looked at his mother. Margaret was standing very still. Her face was doing something that Margaret Whitfield's face almost never did. It was showing what it actually felt. Not performing composure, not managing an impression, just present and pain and something else that didn't have a quick name. The woman my mother spent this afternoon trying to have removed from this property, Declan said, is the reason I'm standing here today, free on my wedding day, as the person my wife agreed to marry. He looked at Ruth directly. She gave me that. And I haven't said it to her in a way that was adequate. So I'm saying it now, in front of everyone, because it's the truest thing I know about how I got here. He set the microphone down, walked back to Nora, who took his hand. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't invite people to fill it. The kind that has its own gravity, that asks the room to hold what it just received for a moment before moving on to the next thing. Margaret was looking at her son. The expression on her face had shifted, the first real shift of the afternoon. The first thing that looked less like strategy and more like something internal moving. She had spent the afternoon certain about the property, certain about her position, certain about who the woman in the navy dress was and what she represented. That certainty had been eroding for an hour. But this, hearing her son describe what he had done and what had been done for him, this was different. This wasn't erosion, this was a wall coming down. She had not known the details. Had known charges, had known the outcome, had been grateful for the outcome without examining it carefully, had told herself a version of events that required less looking than the version Declan had just provided. She looked across the garden at Ruth Calloway, and for the first time since this afternoon began, she looked at her as a person, not a threat, not a trespasser, not a problem to be managed, a person who had done something for her son that she herself had not been able to do. Who had seen something worth saving in him, when Margaret had been too frightened to look closely at what he'd become. A person who had, additionally, been paying taxes on the land Margaret was standing on for 20 years. These two facts existed simultaneously in her mind, and their combination was doing something to her that she didn't yet have words for. Gerald appeared at her elbow. "Margaret, I know," she said. "We need to, I know, Gerald." She looked at him. "Just give me a moment." He gave her a moment. Gerald Foss looked at the documents he had retrieved from the briefcase. Looked at them the way a lawyer looks at documents when he already knows what they say, and is taking a moment to acknowledge, privately, the distance between where he started this afternoon and where he has arrived. He handed them to Margaret. She took them, and she read. Not quickly. Margaret at Whitfield had not skimmed a document since 1989, when a contract clause she'd missed had cost her 14 months of litigation. She read everything now, Every word, every line, she read these. Pruitt stood apart from the crowd while Margaret read. He had been moving toward the periphery since his testimony, since placing the badge on the wall and having it returned. Not retreating, settling. Finding the right distance from the center of things, the way a person finds their footing after a large physical effort. He was looking at the letter still lying on the garden wall, the 2002 letter from Whitfield Property Group. He had looked at it before, once briefly when Ruth had first laid it out. He was looking at it again now with different eyes, the eyes of someone who has said aloud what he did and who is now, for the first time, looking at the document directly rather than at the memory of the document. The memory he had been avoiding for 2 decades. It was smaller than he remembered, not smaller in physical size. Smaller in the sense that things we carry for a long time in silence tend to grow in the carrying, tend to become larger in the dark than they are in light. He had spent 22 years carrying a file he'd closed, and it had become, in the carrying, enormous, a monument to a choice he couldn't unmake. The letter was 1.5 pages, typed, official-looking seals that he could see now, clearly, in broad daylight with 22 years of experience reading documents were slightly wrong. The proportions of the notary seal slightly off. The case number format inconsistent with county practice. He had seen this in 2002. He had been 30 years old and he had seen it. He looked at Ruth. She was standing at the edge of the group, watching Margaret read. Patient. The same patience she'd carried since the moment she walked through the gate. Not the patience of someone waiting for something to be given to them. The patience of someone who has prepared thoroughly and is now allowing events to confirm what preparation made inevitable. She felt him looking and turned. They looked at each other across the lawn. No words. There are conversations that don't require language, that have been conducted in the silences of years and arrive, when they finally surface, already understood by both parties. This was one of those. He had done what he'd done. She had built what she'd built. He had carried it and she had carried it, and today it was, finally, in the open where it had always needed to be. He gave a single nod, small, unambiguous. She returned it, and that was the thing between them settled. Not result resolution was a longer road, a road that would involve depositions and official proceedings and the formal machinery of accountability. But settled, acknowledged, named, he replaced his hat, turned back toward the periphery, left her to what came next. Margaret finished reading. She looked up at Gerald. The contribution to the trust, she said. The amount isn't specified here. The amount will be determined through the restitution process, Gerald said. Coordinated with the federal office, it will be real, Margaret said. She looked at Ruth. You said yes, Ruth said. How real? Real enough to matter to the people who receive it, Ruth said. Real enough to reflect the 22 years of benefit your family received from this property without paying for it. She paused. The federal process will determine the specific figure, but you should plan for it to be significant. Margaret looked at the documents. At the pen Gerald had placed beside them on the garden wall. She looked at her son. Declan was standing at the edge of the garden, Nora beside him. He was not looking at his mother with accusation or appeal. He was simply looking at her. The complete patient attention of someone who has decided to let a person make their own choice and to be present for it. She looked at him for a long moment. He nodded, once, small, the nod of someone who has already decided what the right thing is and is waiting to see if the person he loves will arrive at it. Margaret Whitfield picked up the pen, and she signed, not quickly, not as if she wanted it over with the deliberateness of someone making a decision they intend to keep. She signed all 5 pages, set the pen down, did not look at anyone for a moment. Then she looked at Ruth. Robert, she said, my ex-husband. He was the one who originated the transaction, who found the property and arranged the documentation before it came to Gerald. She said it clearly. Not as mitigation, as the record. I want that understood, not because it changes what I signed. Because it's true and it needs to be part of what Pruitt has. I heard Pruitt said from the edge of the lawn. His notebook already open. I'll give you everything I have on him, Margaret said. Whatever you need, Pruitt nodded. Tonight, if possible. Tonight, she said. Ruth looked at her. Margaret looked back. I didn't know, Margaret said, when we received it. I chose not to ask the question that might have told me. That is not the same as innocence. I understand that. No, Ruth said, it isn't. And there is no adequate response to what you told me about your father. Ruth looked at the letter on the wall. "There isn't," she said. "A beat. Tell me what you need," Margaret said. "To put the nameplate back." Declan Whitfield had been 16 years old the first time he understood what his family had. Not the money, not the property, not the address in Southampton that made certain people's eyes shift when they heard it. That particular shift of recalculation that happened when someone was deciding whether you were worth knowing. He had understood all of that earlier. Too early, probably. The way children absorb the values of the rooms they grow up in before they have the language to question them. What he understood at 16 was different. He had come home from school on a Tuesday in October of 2005 to find his mother in the study with two men he didn't recognize and a set of documents spread across the desk his grandfather had bought at an estate auction in 1987. The men had briefcases. His mother had the expression she wore when something was being handled. The particular focus of a woman who considered management one of her primary skills and was exercising it. He had stood in the doorway for 30 seconds before anyone noticed him. In those 30 seconds he had understood, without being told, that something was being decided. That the documents on the desk were the mechanism by which something was being decided, and that the something had to do with the house. The big house, the Hamptons house, the one they went to in summers, and for Thanksgiving and for the occasional winter weekend when his mother felt that New York was becoming too much. He had backed out of the doorway before anyone saw him, had never asked what it was about, had told himself it was a business matter, a property matter, something adult and legal and not his to understand. His parents had separated 2 years earlier. His father was still involved in various property dealings. Men with briefcases were simply part of how things worked in the world his family inhabited. He was 35 years old now, and he understood what those documents had been. He had understood for 4 years. Had understood since the afternoon he stood in the Eastern District courtroom of Judge Ruth Calloway and had heard the charges read aloud in the flat procedural voice of a court officer, and understood that the sum of his choices had arrived at a place that could not be reasoned with or managed or handled. That this was a room where who you were mattered more than who you knew, where what you had done sat in the air in front of you and could not be repositioned. He had been 31 years old. He had been wearing a suit that cost $3,000. He had been terrified in a way that the suit did nothing to address. Ruth Calloway had entered the courtroom and the room had changed. Not dramatically, not with any gesture or announcement, but in the way rooms change when someone enters them who is fully present, who is completely and without performance exactly who they are. She had read his file. He knew she had read it because of the specific way she looked at him when she looked at him. Not with the bureaucratic neutrality of someone processing a case, but with the focused attention of someone who had read a document carefully and was now looking at the person the document described and deciding whether the document was complete. He had stood very still under that attention. It had lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then she had looked down at the papers on her bench, and the proceeding had continued. The prosecutor laid out the case. 30 minutes of evidence that Declan had no grounds to contest. He had done what he was charged with. His lawyer had told him that the best available outcome was a negotiated plea and significant sentence reduction, and that significant still meant years. The prosecutor was asking for 15. His lawyer believed they could argue it down to 10. 10 years. He had been 31 years old, and 10 years had sounded like the entire rest of his life. Ruth Calloway had listened to all of it, had asked 2 questions of the prosecutor, precise, specific questions that suggested she had read not only the current case file, but background documentation that Declan's own lawyer had not referenced. Had asked 1 question of Declan's lawyer about the timeline of his involvement in the relevant practices. Had then been quiet for a moment that felt for Declan like it lasted the length of his entire adult life. Then she had looked at Declan directly. "Mr. Whitfield," she had said, "I have a question for you, not for your lawyer." "For you," he had said. "Yes, Your Honor." "When did you understand," she had said, "what you were participating in?" Not whether he had understood when. He had looked at her, at the complete attention she was paying him, at the absence of judgment in her face, not the absence of consequence, not the absence of accountability, but the specific absence of the contempt that he had been bracing for and had been told to expect. He had told her the truth. He described the afternoon he was 26 years old when a colleague had walked him through a specific transaction and explained, in language that could not be misunderstood, what the transaction actually was, what the money represented, where it came from, and who had lost it in the losing. He told her that he had continued for 3 more years after that he had not asked the right questions at the beginning, and when he finally understood the answers, he had chosen the money over the questions. He had constructed stories about why that was acceptable. He had known, even as he told those stories, that they were not true. Ruth listened without interruption. She made no notes, asked no follow-up questions. Simply received what he said with the full level attention of someone for whom this information was important and was being treated accordingly. Then she said, "Thank you for answering honestly." She sentenced him to probation, full restitution, mandatory financial counseling, and 200 hours of community service. The community service was to be served at organizations working directly with individuals affected by financial fraud and predatory financial practices. She had been specific about that last part. She looked at him one final time before he left the courtroom. "Don't waste it," she said. He had not wasted it. The 200 hours at the food bank in Brooklyn. The faces across the table. The man who had lost his retirement savings at 63 and was trying to figure out how to eat. The woman who had trusted an investment advisor, someone not unlike who Declan had been, and lost the money saved for her daughter's education. The particular quality of their dignity in circumstances that had not been chosen. He had gone home after the first day and been unable to eat dinner. He had gone back the next day, and the day after that, and somewhere in those 200 hours he had become, her slowly and without announcement, a different person than the one who had stood in that courtroom in the expensive suit. He had met Nora 8 months after his sentence ended. She was doing housing law at a legal aid organization, the kind of work that doesn't make anyone rich but keeps certain promises about what law is supposed to be for. On their first date, she had looked at him with the same quality of complete attention Ruth Calloway had used in the courtroom. Seeing him fully, not editing what she saw, he had told her everything on the 3rd date. She had listened, asked 2 questions, then said, "Are you still that person?" He had said no. She had looked at him for a moment that lasted its own kind of forever. Then, okay. He was thinking about all of this now, standing at the edge of the garden at Belmore Estate on his wedding day, watching Ruth Calloway stand at the stone wall beside the reflecting pool while his mother read through the terms Gerald had retrieved from the briefcase. He was thinking about what it costs to be given something you didn't earn, and what you owe the person who gave it, and whether there is any adequate way to pay it back, or whether the only available answer is to become someone who doesn't need to be given that thing again. Nora was standing beside him. She had not said anything about what he'd said up there at the microphone, had not praised it or processed it aloud or made it into a moment that required his response. She had simply taken his hand, which was, he thought, one of the 1,000 reasons she was the right person. "She's going to want to talk to you," Nora said, looking at Ruth. "I know, not now, but before she leaves." "I know." He looked at Nora. "How are you? This is your wedding day and it's our wedding day," she said. "And it has become something I think we're going to be talking about for the rest of our lives." She looked at him. "I think that's okay. Some days are like that." He looked at the woman he had married 3 hours ago. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "Go talk to your mother." Margaret stood at the garden wall with the documents in her hands. Gerald was beside her, had been beside her since Ruth had opened the briefcase and laid out what was there. Beside her, not in the mode of a lawyer managing a client, but in the mode of a person standing near another person, because proximity is sometimes the only thing available. Margaret read. She read slowly. She was not a woman who skimmed documents, had not been since the Tuesday afternoon in October 1989, when she had signed a contract without reading it carefully and spent 14 months in litigation over a clause she would have caught in 30 seconds if she'd read it properly. She had read every document carefully since then. She read this one carefully. Ruth stood on the other side of the wall, not watching Margaret read, looking at the carriage house, the oak tree, the east path with its loose flagstone, the rose corner where Earl had returned to his work with the deliberate motion of someone who processes difficulty through physical task. The late afternoon light was moving toward the specific quality of Southampton early evening, not gold anymore, shifting into the longer color tones that arrive when the sun gets low over the water and the shadows begin to run east instead of south. Margaret finished reading. She looked up. 5 terms, she said. Yes, Ruth said. Walk me through them. Ruth looked at her. There was a quality to Margaret's voice that had not been there at any point earlier in the afternoon. Not defeat. Margaret Whitfield was not built to defeat, and this was not what defeat looked or sounded like. Something more complicated. The voice of someone who has put down a weight they've been carrying long enough that they weren't aware of its shape anymore, and are now feeling, for the first time, the specific contours of what they'd been holding. A lease agreement for Belmore Estate, Ruth said. Market rate for Southampton County adjusted annually, renewable year to year, subject to compliance with all terms. Immediate termination clause triggered by any breach. She looked at Margaret. You would have a legal right to be here, which you currently do not. Margaret nodded once. Reading. 2nd. Gerald makes a voluntary disclosure to the Federal Evidence Office. Full cooperation. The scope and timeline to be coordinated with my attorney. Ruth looked at Gerald. Voluntary cooperation carries different weight than compelled cooperation in federal proceedings. You know that, Gerald said. I know that. 3rd. The Callaway Educational Trust will be publicly identified. The foundation's history and purpose will be disclosed, and a contribution to the trust's endowment will be made by the Whitfield family. The specific amount to be determined through the restitution process, coordinated with the federal office. It will be a real number, not symbolic, not nominal, real. Margaret's jaw worked, but she kept reading. 4th. Ruth paused. To look toward the Rose Corner, Earl Briggs will receive full retirement compensation, calculated at the appropriate rate for 45 years of service to this property, transferred to him within 30 days of today. She looked back at Margaret. He has kept this garden in the condition it's in for 4.5 decades. He has maintained this property through ownership he was not told about and circumstances he was not responsible for. That service has never been formally acknowledged. Margaret looked at the Rose Corner, at Earl's bent back working the late afternoon trim, at the particular straightness of the rows he maintained, at the health of plants that had been tended with 45 years of specific knowledge and consistent care. She had never, in 20 years of living here, learned the name of a single rose he grew. She had known his first name, had used it to summon him and to dismiss him, had not known his last name until today when she'd heard it used in the context of formal documentation. 5th, Ruth said. She reached into the briefcase, removed something wrapped in cloth, old cloth, soft from long use as wrapping, shaped now to the object it had been protecting. She unwrapped it on the garden wall. Brass, tarnished with age and storage but solid, the particular quality of something made to last that has lasted. Letters in the style of the 1950s, clean, composed, without ornament, Callaway Estate. This goes back on the wall today, Ruth said. Before I leave this property, in the original mounting holes. She looked at the nameplate, then at Margaret. My grandfather paid $40 for this in 1951. He touched it with 2 fingers every time he walked past it for 30 years. It was the first thing removed when your family took possession. She looked at Margaret directly. It is the first thing restored. Silence. Margaret looked at the brass nameplate on the garden wall between them. She looked at it for a long time. Long enough for the quality of her looking to change. Long enough for what had been shifting in her all afternoon to complete its movement. These are not negotiable, Ruth said. And they are also, I want to be specific about this, the complete terms under which this matter does not proceed to a federal courtroom. Not a reduced version of what I could pursue. The complete version of what I am choosing to pursue, in the form of terms rather than prosecution. She looked at Margaret. My father believed this was his failure, she said. He was a man who kept his promises, who had spent his life honoring what his father built and what his grandfather started. He received a letter in 2002 that told him he had lost the thing he was supposed to protect, and he spent 2 years trying to understand how he had failed and never found the answer, because the answer was that he hadn't. Her voice remained even, precise. The precision of someone who has said this to herself many times in the silence of many rooms and is now saying it out loud for the first and last time. He died in April of 2004. He was 78 years old. He died thinking the failure was his. She put her hand on the nameplate. "I am not interested in destroying your family," she said. "I am not interested in the version of this afternoon that ends with prosecution and prison and the dismantling of lives. I have had 11 years to pursue that version. I chose this one." She looked at Margaret. "But I am also not interested in pretending that what happened here was a misunderstanding or an accident or a clerical error. It was a deliberate fraud committed against an old man who trusted official documents, and the terms reflect that." Margaret looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the federal folder, at the nameplate, at the 4 small holes in the stone wall that had been waiting 22 years for the brass to come back to them. He gave a small, precise nod. Margaret looked at her son. Declan was standing at the edge of the garden, Nora beside him. He was not looking at his mother with accusation or appeal. He was simply looking at her. The complete, patient attention of someone who has decided to let a person make their own choice and to be present for it. She looked at him for a long moment. He nodded, once, small, the nod of someone who has already decided what the right thing is and is waiting to see if the person he loves will arrive at it. Margaret Whitfield looked at the pen Gerald had placed on the wall beside the documents. She picked it up and she signed. Not quickly, not as if she wanted it over with, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision they intend to keep. She signed all 5 pages, set the pen down, did not look at anyone for a moment. Then she looked at Ruth. "I didn't know," she said. "When we received the property in 2002, the documentation that came to us, I believed it was legitimate." Ruth looked at her. "But I didn't ask," Margaret said. "When there were things that didn't quite, when there were questions I could have asked. I chose not to." She paused. "Because it was what we needed and the papers looked right and I preferred not knowing to knowing." Ruth said nothing. "I understand," Margaret said carefully, that is not the same as innocence." "No," Ruth said. "It isn't. And I understand that there is no adequate response to what you told me about your father." Ruth looked at the nameplate. "There isn't," she said. Margaret looked at the documents she had just signed, then at the nameplate, then at the 4 holes in the stone wall. "Tell me what you need," she said, "to put it back." Earl knew where the tools were. Of course he did. He had known where everything on this property was for 45 years. The storage shed behind the carriage house. 3rd shelf from the bottom left side. A box of masonry anchors that he had purchased himself 3 years ago when he had noticed the garden wall near the east gate needed repointing, and had repointed it on his own initiative because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. He brought the anchors out in his hands. Declan was already moving toward the reflecting pool when Earl came around the corner of the carriage house. They looked at each other briefly. No one had asked Declan to help. He had simply begun moving when Earl began moving, because the afternoon had made him someone who moved toward things that were right, rather than assessing whether moving was appropriate. They worked together at the stone wall. Earl set the anchors, checked the alignment, made small adjustments with the precision of someone who has been doing this specific category of work for most of his adult life and does not need to think about the mechanics of it anymore, only the result. Declan held the nameplate level while Earl drove the anchors home. They did not talk. There was nothing in the task that required language, and both of them seemed to understand that. Some work is its own communication. When the nameplate was seated, the brass flush against the stone, the 4 anchors engaged in their original holes, the Callaway name resting exactly where it had rested for 30 years before its removal. Earl stepped back. He looked at it. Callaway Estate. The brass was tarnished, would need attention, polishing, proper treatment, the kind of care that brought old metal back to what it had been. But it was there, in the right place, in the original holes that had been waiting for it with the patience of stone. Earl pressed his lips together, removed his hat, held it at his side. Ruth came to stand beside him. She looked at the nameplate, looked at the letters, looked at the mounting holes that had been empty for 22 years and were now holding something again. The fountain ran behind them. The light was fully evening now, the long pink and blue of Southampton summer at this hour, the light that changes the qualities of everything it touches and makes old things look older in the best possible sense. "He used to stop here every time," Earl said. His voice was quiet, for Ruth only, not for the lawn. Every single time he walked past, 2 fingers he demonstrated with his own hand, index and middle pressed lightly against the air where the nameplate now sat. like he was checking it was still there. I know, Ruth said. Last time I saw him do it was the summer of 2001. Earl looked at the nameplate. He came out in August that year, just for a weekend. He was already, you could see he was getting older. Moving slower, but he walked the whole property. The whole thing slow as he went, and he stopped here. Earl touched the nameplate's edge with one finger. Not sentimental, factual. He stood here for a while, longer than usual. I always wondered if he knew if he felt something was coming. Ruth was quiet. He was a good man, Earl said. Yes, Ruth said he was. They stood there for a moment. Two people who had known Thomas Calloway, one who had tended his land, and one who had been his daughter, standing in the presence of something his father had made that was back where it belonged. Nora crossed the lawn toward Ruth, not tentative, not performing courage, just moving with the directness of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. She stopped beside Ruth. Earl, reading the moment with the accuracy of someone who has spent decades reading the social weather of a single property, moved back toward the rose corner without being asked. Not far, close enough to be present, far enough to give the women what the moment required. Judge Calloway, Nora said. Ruth looked at her, but Nora's eyes were bright. Not crying, she had moved through that earlier when the revelation first arrived and had come out the other side into something calmer and more settled. The particular calm of someone who has received information they needed and has found a place to put it. I have to tell you something, Nora said, and I want to say it properly. Not because the moment requires it, but because because there has been something I needed to say to a specific person for a long time, and I didn't know who that person was. Until today. Ruth waited. When I was 13 years old, Nora said, my father was a middle school math teacher in Southampton. He had been teaching for 11 years. My mother worked 2 jobs, waitress in the mornings, hotel laundry in the evenings. We lived in a rental on the east side of the county, the part of Southampton that doesn't make the magazines. She said this without bitterness. A statement of fact. My father had been saving money since I was born for the possibility of college. Not certainty, possibility. By the time I was 13, he had saved enough for approximately 1 semester at a state school. She looked at Ruth steadily. In the fall of 2006, we received a letter from something called the Calloway Educational Trust. It said that my family had been identified as a candidate for scholarship support and that if I wished to apply, there was a process. She paused. My father read it 3 times. He was certain it was a mistake. He called the contact number in the letter. Twice. The 3rd time someone answered and confirmed it was not a mistake. Ruth said nothing. The scholarship covered my undergraduate degree at Fordham, then law school at Cardozo. Nora looked at the nameplate on the wall at the Calloway name. I have been a lawyer for 6 years. I do housing law, tenant advocacy, eviction defense, the kind of work that doesn't make anyone rich but keeps certain promises about what the law is supposed to be for. She looked back at Ruth. My father used to introduce me to every person he met as my daughter the lawyer. He said it until the last day I saw him, November of last year. A pause, Ruth's expression did not change. But something in it deepened, a quality of attention that had its own weight. He died in February, Nora said. 7 months ago. He had been sick for 2 years. She took a breath. He never knew who funded the scholarship. We tried for years to find out. He wrote a letter to the foundation address every year for 15 years. He didn't know if anyone read them. He sent them anyway. I read them, Ruth said. Nora closed her eyes. Opened them. He wrote well, Ruth said. He was a man who chose his words carefully. Every year the letter was different. Not a form letter. Each one was specific to that year. What had happened, what you had accomplished, what he was grateful for. She paused. The last one arrived in January before he died. Nora pressed her hand over her mouth. He wrote about your wedding, Ruth said. About the man you were going to marry. About what it meant to him to know that you had built a life he was proud of. She looked at Nora. He wrote that he had spent 30 years in a classroom trying to give his students the same thing the scholarship had given you. Not just education, but the permission to believe that their life could be what they made it rather than what circumstances allowed. She paused. He said that the foundation had given you that permission when he couldn't afford to himself. Nora was crying now. Quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't interrupt itself. I read every application personally, Ruth said. Not as an administrative exercise. Everyone. Your father's letter was the first piece of correspondence I received from the foundation. It arrived before the scholarship program was 6 months old. He had found the address somewhere and written to say thank you to whoever was responsible. She paused. It was the letter that told me the program was right. That told me what I was doing and why it mattered. Nora lowered her hand from her mouth. He named it, she said. In his letters, he always referred to it as the gift. Capital G, just the gift, like it was a proper noun. She looked at Ruth. He said that what the gift had actually given him was the knowledge that someone he had never met believed his daughter deserved a future. That strangers sometimes act on behalf of strangers, that the world contained that. Ruth looked at the nameplate. My grandfather believed that, she said. He built this estate on it. He came up from Virginia with $20 and the belief that he could build something that would outlast him and that the building of it was its own answer to the people who told him it wasn't possible. She touched the nameplate's edge with 2 fingers, the same gesture Earl had described, the same gesture Thomas Calloway had made for 30 years. The foundation was the continuation of that, using what this land had given my family to give something to people who needed the same thing my grandfather had needed. Not money, exactly. Permission. Nora looked at the 2-finger gesture. He did that, she said. Your grandfather, that's what Earl described. Every time he walked past, Ruth said. Checking it was still there. Nora stepped forward and put her arms around Ruth Calloway, not carefully, not with the polite restraint of a social occasion, with the full force of 18 years of gratitude that had had nowhere specific to go and had just found its address. Ruth stood very still for a single second. Then she put her arms around the young woman in the wedding dress and held on. The lawn was quiet around them. Owen lowered his camera. Some things are not for the record. Some things are just for the people inside them. The evening came in fully. The light completed its turn from pink to the first blue of coming dark, the way Southampton evenings do in summer. Gradual, unhurried, as if the day is making sure it has finished everything before it goes. Ruth stood at the reflecting pool, alone for the first time since she had arrived. The crowd had dispersed, not fully, not completely, guests drifting back toward the reception in the particular drift of people who have witnessed something large and need the ordinary texture of food and conversation and familiar social mechanics to absorb it. Gerald had excused himself to make calls. Pruitt had walked to the driveway, where he sat in his car for 10 minutes doing whatever a man does when he has put down a weight he's been carrying for 22 years and needs to sit with the lightness of it for a while before driving home. Declan and Nora had returned to their wedding. There was still a wedding to have. The band had not packed up. The caterers had not cleared the tables. The flowers had not stopped working. A wedding had been planned and paid for, and most of the people who had come for it were still here and were, with the resilience of people who have good food in front of them and stories to tell each other, beginning to have it. Ruth stood at the pool and listened to the fountain. That east spout, that slight irregularity. Character, her grandfather had said. Don't fix what has character. She heard footsteps behind her, recognized the particular rhythm of them before she turned. Margaret, 58 years old. The Patek Philippe still on her wrist. Some things are structural, not atmospheric, but something different in how she carried herself. The practiced uprightness was still there, but the performance in it was gone. She was just standing, just walking, just arriving at the pool where Ruth was standing and stopping beside her. They stood together for a moment without speaking. The fountain ran, the light moved. My mother, Margaret said finally, bought a painting in 1987. At a gallery on the Upper East Side. She paid what she could afford, which was not very much, because she loved it and she had saved for months. She was looking at the fountain. It turned out later that the gallery had misattributed it. The painting was not what they had said it was. She had paid for something she believed was one thing and received something else. Ruth waited. She was not angry at herself for buying it, Margaret said. She was angry at the gallery, at the misrepresentation, at the fact that she had trusted what she'd been told, and what she'd been told was not true. She paused. She kept the painting. She said that the painting itself was not dishonest, just the story around it. She looked at Ruth. I have been telling myself a version of that story about this house, she said, for 22 years. That we received it honestly, that whatever happened before us was not our concern. That the papers were legitimate and the transaction was real, and what came before was history, and history is not accountable to the present. Ruth said nothing. I knew there were questions I hadn't asked, Margaret said. I knew it at the time. I chose not to ask them because the answer might have been something I didn't want to know. She paused. That is not the same thing as innocence. I understand that now. I understood it, actually, somewhere in the middle of this afternoon, but I wasn't ready to say it until now. Ruth looked at the fountain. My father would have forgiven you, she said. Eventually, he was built for forgiveness. It was structural in him the way the uprightness is structural in you. She paused. But I am not my father, and what I offer is not forgiveness. What I offer is terms. And the terms are what they are. I know, Margaret said. I signed them. You signed them 20 minutes ago, Ruth said. That's different from understanding what you signed. Margaret considered this. What do you want me to understand? She said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That the terms are not punishment, she said. They are restitution. There is a distinction. Punishment is for my satisfaction. Restitution is for the account. She looked at the pool. My grandfather built this pool. My father grew up swimming in it. I learned to swim in it when I was 4 years old, with my grandfather standing in the water and my father watching from the edge. She paused. That history does not disappear because the property changed hands fraudulently. It lives in the ground, in the stone, in the bark of the oak tree with my father's initials 57 years into the growing. She looked at Margaret. The terms make the account honest. They don't erase what happened, but they make the present honest in relation to it. Margaret was quiet. The scholarship fund, she said. The Callaway Educational Trust. How long? Since 2006, Ruth said. 2 years after your father died. Yes. Margaret looked at the reflecting pool. You used the land's history to build something. I used what I had, Ruth said. The trust had assets, the property taxes I'd been paying, the estate funds. The land itself. I used them to do what my grandfather believed land was for. She paused. He said that property without purpose is just possession. That what made something yours was not the deed but what you made from it. Margaret looked at the nameplate on the wall, at the Callaway name in the old brass. I have a granddaughter, she said. She's 3 years old. She lives in Brooklyn with her parents. She paused. She'll be applying to college in 15 years. Ruth looked at her. The terms include a contribution to the trust, Ruth said. Whatever comes from that contribution, the fund doesn't discriminate by family of origin. It looks at need and application. I'm not, Margaret stopped. Started again. I wasn't suggesting she apply. I was saying, she paused. I was saying that I will be watching for the next 15 years what that fund does. What it enables, who it gives permission to. She looked at Ruth. I want to see it. I want to know what it does. Ruth looked at her for a moment. You'll see the annual reports, she said. The foundation sends them to all contributors. The names are anonymized, but the stories aren't. Margaret nodded. They stood there a while longer, the fountain, the evening. Then Margaret said, he touched it every time. Yes, Ruth said. Earl told me just now. He came and told me. I don't know why he thought you should know. Margaret was quiet. I didn't know his last name, she said. 20 years I knew his first name and I used it like a verb. Earl do this, Earl fix that. She paused. I didn't know his last name was Briggs until I saw it in the documents today. Ruth said nothing. I'm going to learn the names of the roses, Margaret said. All of them, every variety he tends. She paused. That's a small thing. Yes, Ruth said. It is. But it's the kind of small thing that means something different from the small things I've been paying attention to. Yes, Ruth said. It is. They stood in the quiet of that for a moment. 2 women at a reflecting pool in the last light of a summer evening, both older than when the afternoon started, in the specific way of people who have been changed by a day. Then Ruth reached into her bag and took out a photograph, black and white, the edges soft with age and handling. A man in his mid-40s, younger than Ruth was now, standing in front of the iron gate of Belmore Estate. Hand on the nameplate. Smiling with the uncomplicated pride of someone who is standing in front of something he has built and knows it will outlast him. Thomas Callaway. Ruth held the photograph and looked at it. She looked at her father's face, at the hand on the nameplate, at the gate behind him and the garden visible through the bars and the particular quality of the light in the photograph. Summer morning, the best light. She looked at the nameplate on the wall beside the reflecting pool, at the Callaway name in the old brass. At the 4 anchor holes that had been waiting 22 years. I kept my promise, Dad, she said, quietly, for him. Just for him. The fountain ran. A small wind moved through the oak tree and the leaves shifted briefly and settled. Margaret took one step back. To give the moment its space. She had enough grace for that. Ruth wrapped the photograph in the cloth that had wrapped the nameplate for 22 years. Placed it in her bag, picked up the briefcase. The federal folder inside still closed, still sealed. All 11 years of meticulous documentation resting in the dark of the case where they would remain. The morning would bring attorneys and filings and the structured machinery of legal resolution. That was tomorrow. Tonight the folder stayed closed. She had not needed to open it. She had always hoped she wouldn't. She walked through the garden toward the gate. The path she had taken when she arrived, the east path, the shortcut through the carriage house passage, the particular route of someone who knows a place from the inside. Earl was at the gate. She had not seen him move there. He had simply arrived, the way Earl arrived at things on this property, quietly, at the right moment, without announcement. He walked with her to the gate. Neither of them spoke. At the gate he stopped. She stopped beside him. They looked at the iron crest above the entrance. The Calloway name in the old metalwork, not welded over up here, just legible. Her great-grandfather's family name in iron that had been standing since 1924. "Your grandfather picked that pattern himself," Earl said. "I know because my father told me. He was there when it arrived, the delivery. Your grandfather made my father come and look at it before they installed it." Earl's thumb touched the brim of the hat he'd put back on. He said he wanted everyone who came through this gate to know whose land it was, whose family had built it. Ruth looked at the crest. "They'll know," she said. Earl nodded, stepped back. She walked through the gate and across the street to her car. The cognac briefcase in one hand, the soft cloth-wrapped photograph in her bag, the evening air on her face, the particular smell of this specific piece of Long Island at this specific time of year, salt and rose and old stone, the smell of a place that had been in her memory for 22 years, but had not been in her lungs. She had forgotten how it smelled. She was surprised now that she had ever forgotten. She opened the car, put the briefcase in, sat in the driver's seat, both hands on the wheel, did not start the engine yet. Through the windshield she could see the gate, the Calloway name in the iron. Beyond it, visible in the evening light, the nameplate on the wall by the reflecting pool. The Calloway name in brass, back in its original holes, in the right place after a long time in the wrong one. She thought about her grandfather, who had come up from Virginia with $20 and a truck, and had built something that he believed would outlast him. He had been right. She thought about her father, who had carried the promise of this place in his body for 78 years, and the fraud of its loss for the last 2 of them, who had died in April in a hospital room in Queens, having never known that the title had never transferred, that the land had always been his, that the promise had never been broken. She had not been able to give him that. It was the one thing she had not been able to do. She started the engine, pulled out from the curb, drove past the gate, slowly, and out onto Meadowbrook Lane. The evening was fully dark now at the edges, still lit at the center, the sky above Southampton, that particular blue-black of summer night arriving. She drove. She did not look in the rearview mirror as she passed the gate, not because she was done with this place, not because she was leaving it behind, because she didn't need to. The land was there, would be there tomorrow. The nameplate in its original holes, the foundation initials in the concrete, the crest in the iron, the initials in the oak bark, 57 years into their growing. It would all be there, the way land is there, the way things built to last are there. The way a promise kept by the person who made it to the person it was made to doesn't need to be looked at to be real. It was real. She drove into the evening. She was going home, and home, for the first time in 22 years, had an address again.